February 1944. Fisher Body Tank Arsenal, Grand Blanc, Michigan. The assembly line worker tightened the final bolts on ammunition storage bins that looked fundamentally different from every Sherman tank built before this moment. These bins sat low in the hull floor, encased in double-walled steel containers with a 4-inch gap between the walls. That gap would be filled with a water and glycerin mixture, creating the first production wet storage Sherman tanks in American history. This single modification, born from desperate field reports and exhaustive ballistic testing, would transform crew survival rates from catastrophic to manageable. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. Shermans with dry ammunition storage burned in 60 to 80% of cases when armor was penetrated. Shermans with wet storage burned in 10 to 15% of cases. The difference between these numbers represented thousands of American lives that would be saved not through thicker armor or bigger guns, but through understanding why tanks caught fire and engineering a practical solution. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of wet storage begins not in Michigan factories but in North African sand, where British tank crews first encountered a problem that would haunt Sherman operations throughout 1942 and into 1943. When the Second Battle of El Alamein commenced in October 1942, over 250 newly arrived M4A1 Shermans formed the backbone of British armoured formations. These tanks, rushed from American production lines and hastily modified for desert conditions, represented the best medium tank available to Allied forces at that moment. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could penetrate German Panzer IV frontal armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. Its welded or cast hull provided 50mm of armour sloped at 56 degrees, creating an effective thickness of approximately 90mm. The Continental R975 radial engine delivered reliable power in desert heat that destroyed less robust German powertrains. By every measurable specification, the Sherman dominated its opponents. Yet within weeks of sustained combat, British tank crews began reporting a disturbing pattern. Shermans hit by German anti-tank rounds did not simply lose mechanical function or suffer crew casualties. They burned catastrophically, with ammunition cooking off in chain reactions that filled crew compartments with flames and explosive overpressure within seconds of penetration. Tank commanders who survived these fires described watching their vehicles transformed into crematoriums before they could evacuate. The British Army collected systematic data on knocked-out tanks recovered from battlefields. The statistics revealed grim truths about Sherman vulnerability. When German 75mm or 88mm rounds penetrated Sherman armour, between 60 and 80% of affected tanks caught fire. This percentage exceeded fire rates for British Crusader and Valentine tanks. It substantially exceeded fire rates for captured German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs examined under similar conditions. British ordnance officers began investigating the cause immediately. Initial assumptions focused on fuel. The Sherman used gasoline rather than diesel, and conventional wisdom suggested gasoline engines created greater fire risk. This theory collapsed under examination. German Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and later Panthers all used gasoline engines. Soviet T-34s used diesel and burned at comparable or higher rates when penetrated. Fuel type explained nothing about why Shermans burned more frequently than equivalent vehicles. The answer became clear when investigators examined the internal layout of burned-out hulls. Sherman ammunition stowage placed rounds throughout the crew compartment. 17 rounds sat in a ready rack in the left sponson, easily accessible but completely unprotected. 11 rounds stood vertically along the sides of the turret basket, positioned where any side penetration would strike them directly. 8 additional rounds rested on top of the turret basket floor. Only 60 rounds stored beneath the turret basket floor enjoyed any meaningful protection from penetrating projectiles. Each 75mm round contained over 2 kilograms of propellant designed to burn rapidly and completely. When a German armor-piercing round penetrated Sherman side armor, it passed through the crew compartment where dozens of exposed propellant charges waited. The penetrating round generated temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius. Metal fragments from armor spalling traveled at supersonic velocities through the interior space. Either the heat or the fragments would ignite exposed propellant, triggering a cascade that consumed every round in the fighting compartment within seconds. British field workshops attempted expedient solutions throughout late 1942. Tank crews welded additional armor plates over sponson ammunition bins, adding 1 inch of steel protection to the left side storage. 3 access hatches were cut into turret basket floors, allowing the assistant driver to pass ammunition upward to the loader from the protected floor storage. These modifications reduced exposed ammunition from 97 rounds to 19 rounds, a substantial improvement that required extensive field modification work. Unfortunately, British workshop capabilities could not retrofit these changes across entire armoured divisions. The modifications demanded precision welding, careful measurement to maintain turret traverse clearance, and structural reinforcement to support additional armour weight. Field workshops lacked the equipment, the trained personnel, and the time required to convert hundreds of tanks while maintaining operational readiness for ongoing combat operations. American ordnance authorities received British field reports by early 1943. The Armoured Board, responsible for testing and evaluating tank design modifications, initiated comprehensive investigation into Sherman fire causes. 2 M4 tanks and complete ammunition loads arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for controlled ballistic testing, designed to determine exactly what happened when armor was penetrated. The testing protocol was methodical and unambiguous. Engineers fired 37mm and 75mm armor-piercing rounds at Sherman hulls loaded with ammunition but containing no fuel or oil. If the fire problem stemmed from fuel ignition, these tests would produce minimal flames. If the problem originated with ammunition placement, the tests would recreate battlefield fire conditions. The results exceeded the worst predictions. 90% of penetrations that struck the fighting compartment or turret produced immediate fires when ammunition was present. The fires burned with intense heat, consuming propellant charges and often detonating high explosive shells in sympathetic reactions. Carbon dioxide fire extinguishers, standard Sherman equipment with 2 10-pound fixed systems and 2 4-pound portable units, proved completely ineffective against ammunition fires. Only massive water quantities could suppress these blazes. Engineers then tested a proposed solution developed from British field modifications. Ammunition bins were surrounded by water-filled jackets, creating a barrier between penetrating projectiles and propellant charges. The first design attempt failed spectacularly. When a test round struck a water-surrounded ammunition bin, hydraulic shock from the displaced water tore the entire rack apart, scattering ammunition throughout the test hull and creating worse conditions than unprotected storage. The solution required engineering sophistication that balanced protection with structural integrity. Designers created double-walled storage containers with concentric steel shells, separated by a 4-inch gap. This gap would be filled with a water and glycerin mixture, providing liquid thermal protection while allowing some airspace at the top to absorb hydraulic shock. When penetrated, individual storage cells might rupture, but the overall rack structure would maintain integrity. The new ammunition layout moved beyond simple protective containers. All main gun ammunition relocated to the hull floor beneath the turret basket, placing every round below the track line, where penetrating hits were statistically least likely. This lower placement meant German rounds, striking the upper hull or turret, would pass through crew stations without encountering ammunition. Only direct hits through the belly armor or very low side hits could reach the protected floor storage. Testing the new wet storage design at Aberdeen Proving Ground produced dramatically different results from the catastrophic dry storage trials. Engineers fired 37mm and 75mm rounds at hulls equipped with water-jacketed floor ammunition bins. Out of 14 storage cells punctured by direct hits, only 2 caught fire. The reduction in fire probability, from 90% to approximately 15%, represented the most significant single improvement in crew survivability achieved through any Sherman modification during the entire war. The wet storage redesign presented substantial manufacturing challenges. Moving ammunition to the floor required relocating numerous components that previously occupied that space. Batteries moved from hull floor positions up into sponson compartments. The auxiliary generator, essential for radio operation and turret power when the main engine was not running, relocated from its hull floor mounting to a position at the rear of the transmission. The turret basket, which had provided a complete floor isolating the crew from hull components, was reduced to a half basket and eventually eliminated entirely on late production vehicles, allowing direct access to floor-mounted ammunition. These changes complicated production at precisely the moment when American factories were achieving peak Sherman output rates. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, Fisher Body Tank Arsenal, and 9 other facilities produced over 3,000 Shermans monthly by mid-1943. Implementing wet storage modifications required retooling assembly lines, retraining workers, and managing supply chains for new components while maintaining production quotas that supplied not just American armored divisions, but British, French, Polish, and Soviet forces through Lend-Lease. Production planners determined that wet storage would be implemented only on new large hatch hull variants then entering production. Small hatch hull Shermans, including M4A, 2 tanks destined for Soviet and British forces, and M4 composite hull vehicles, would retain dry ammunition storage with supplemental armor plates welded over sponson bins. The M4 and M4A3 105mm armed tanks maintained their own dry storage configuration due to the different dimensions of 105mm ammunition. Wet storage production began in January 1944 with the M4A 176mm tanks. These vehicles, mounting the new higher-velocity 76mm M1 gun in the larger T-23 turret design, incorporated wet storage as standard equipment. The W designation in their nomenclature, M4A176W, indicated wet ammunition storage, distinguishing them from earlier dry storage variants. February 1944 saw wet storage implementation expand to M4A, 3 tanks with 75mm guns, the M4A 375W configuration. March brought wet storage to M4, 3 tanks with 76mm guns, designated M4A 376W. By May, even M4A2 tanks with 76mm guns received wet storage, despite this variant being produced primarily for Lend-Lease rather than American service. The M4A3E2 assault tank, commonly called the Jumbo Sherman with its thick frontal armor, incorporated wet storage when production began in June 1944. American tank units in England awaiting the Normandy invasion received the first wet storage. Shermans in mid-July 1944, weeks after D-Day. The 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions took delivery of M4A 176W tanks intended to provide improved anti-armour capability against German Panthers and Tigers. These units also began receiving M4A3 75W and M4A3 76W tanks as production accelerated through summer 1944. Tank crews noticed the differences immediately. The wet storage tanks had noticeably different interior layouts with floor ammunition access requiring the loader to reach down rather than pulling rounds from sponson racks at convenient chest height. The absence of a complete turret basket floor initially concerned some crews who worried about catching feet or equipment in the exposed drivetrain components below. The water glycerin mixture in the ammunition jackets added approximately 400 pounds to vehicle weight, a modest increase that had minimal impact on mobility, but represented substantial liquid volume that theoretically required maintenance. Initial crew training emphasized that wet storage did not make tanks immune to fire. The system reduced fire probability. It did not eliminate the possibility entirely. Crews received instruction on checking the water glycerin mixture levels, though in practice this maintenance rarely occurred in combat conditions. The mixture itself used a proprietary compound initially called Amudamp, which proved less corrosive than pure water and provided better thermal properties than water alone. Combat effectiveness evaluation of wet storage tanks began in France during August and September 1944. First Army ordnance officers systematically examined every knocked-out Sherman recovered from battlefields, documenting the cause of loss and whether the vehicle had burned. The emerging statistics confirmed the Aberdeen Proving Ground test results. Dry storage Shermans continued showing fire rates between 60 and 80% when penetrated. Wet storage Shermans showed fire rates between 10 and 15%. The survival implications extended beyond the vehicles themselves to the crews operating them. A Sherman tank hit by German anti-tank fire typically had seconds between penetration and catastrophic fire in dry storage variants. Crew members closest to the penetration point, usually the loader or assistant driver, depending on impact location, often died from the initial armor spalling and projectile passage. The remaining crew members faced desperate evacuation through hatches while fighting shock, wounds, and rapidly spreading flames. Wet storage fundamentally changed this timeline. A penetration that struck ammunition storage might still cause fire, but the water jackets provided precious seconds of delay before propellant ignited. Those seconds allowed crew members to react, to assist wounded comrades, to exit through hatches before flames consumed the fighting compartment. The statistical reduction from 75% fire probability to 12% fire probability translated directly into substantially higher crew survival rates, even in vehicles that were knocked out of action. The psychological impact of wet storage affected crew confidence and combat performance. Tank commanders in dry storage, Shermans understood intellectually that their vehicles were vulnerable to catastrophic fire. Every engagement with German armor carried the knowledge that a timelo to the rees, penetrating hit would likely result in their tank becoming an inferno. This knowledge created understandable hesitation, encouraging crews to fight from longer ranges, to avoid close engagements, to prioritize survival over aggressive tactical action. Wet storage crews faced the same enemy weapons and the same tactical situations, but with meaningfully different survival prospects. The knowledge that ammunition fires were unlikely, even if armor was penetrated, removed one major source of fear from combat operations. Crew members still faced death or injury from penetrating projectiles, from armor spalling, from exploding ammunition, from countless other battlefield hazards. But they no longer faced near-certain incineration if their tank was hit. This psychological shift enabled more aggressive tactical behavior, more willingness to close with enemy positions, greater confidence in executing maneuvers that exposed the vehicle to enemy fire. American armored doctrine emphasized combined arms operations with tank infantry cooperation, artillery support, and air superiority, providing advantages that offset German technical superiority in individual tank characteristics. Wet storage enhanced this doctrine by allowing American tank crews to execute their tactical roles with reduced fear of catastrophic fire. Sherman tanks could advance in support of infantry assaults without crews hesitating due to fire risk. Tank commanders could order their vehicles forward into favorable firing positions without calculating whether the potential gain justified the probability of burning if hit. By early 1945, the majority of Sherman tanks in American armored divisions incorporated wet storage. First Army statistics covering 883 tanks examined from 1944 to 1945 operations showed that 38% of all tanks, including Shermans, M5 light tanks, M24 light tanks, and M26 heavy tanks had burned when lost. This overall figure included both dry storage and wet storage. Shermans, demonstrating that even with wet storage improvements, tank fires remained a significant combat hazard across all vehicle types. The German military never developed an equivalent ammunition protection system. Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger tanks all stored ammunition throughout their fighting compartments without water jackets or comparable fire suppression systems. German tanks caught fire at rates comparable to early dry storage Shermans when their ammunition was struck by penetrating projectiles. This parity in vulnerability contradicted post-war narratives that portrayed German tanks as technically superior in all respects to Allied vehicles. Soviet forces, who received over 4,000 M4A2 Sherman tanks through Lend-Lease, particularly valued the wet storage variants for their reduced fire tendency. Soviet tankers reported that Shermans were substantially less prone to catastrophic ammunition detonation than Soviet T-34 tanks, which stored ammunition throughout the hull in exposed bins that frequently ignited when struck. The Soviet preference for diesel engines in the T-34 provided no fire protection advantage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. As Soviet crews learned that ammunition fires occurred independently of fuel type, British forces continued using Shermans through the end of the war, with 17,000 total Shermans delivered, including wet storage variants from mid-1944 onward. British crews adapted their loading procedures to the floor-mounted wet storage bins, developing techniques for efficient ammunition handling despite the changed layout. The British 17-pounder armed Sherman Firefly, mounting a powerful anti-tank gun in a modified Sherman hull, received wet storage in late production versions, combining superior firepower with improved crew survivability. The wet storage modification represented triumph of empirical engineering over theoretical design. American ordnance engineers did not develop revolutionary new technology or implement sophisticated materials science breakthroughs. They identified a specific problem through systematic investigation, designed a practical solution using existing industrial capabilities, and implemented that solution across an established production program without disrupting output rates. This approach differed fundamentally from German tank development philosophy. German engineers pursued advanced specifications and sophisticated technical solutions, creating tanks like the Panther and Tiger that incorporated cutting-edge metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and complex mechanical systems. These tanks often proved superior to Shermans in direct combat when they functioned properly and reached the battlefield. However, German design philosophy did not prioritize addressing known vulnerabilities like ammunition fires through practical engineering modifications. The mathematics of crew survival validated the American approach. A Sherman with wet storage that reliably reached the battlefield and fought with 12% fire probability when hit proved more valuable than a technically sophisticated German tank that suffered chronic mechanical failures and burned at 70% probability when its ammunition was struck. Crew training, tactical doctrine, and operational availability mattered more than individual vehicle specifications in determining combat effectiveness. Post-war tank design incorporated the lessons learned from Sherman wet storage development. The United States M46 Patton, M47 Patton, and M48 Patton tanks all featured ammunition storage isolated in protected compartments below turret floors, with provisions for fire suppression. The M60 series tanks implemented separate ammunition compartments with blowout panels designed to direct ammunition fires away from crew areas. These designs acknowledged that preventing ammunition fires entirely was impossible, but managing fire consequences through thoughtful layout and protective systems could save crew lives. Modern main battle tanks continue this philosophy. The M1 Abrams stores its main gun ammunition in a separate bustle compartment behind the turret, isolated from the crew by armored blast doors and equipped with blowout panels that direct any ammunition explosion outward rather than into the crew compartment. This design principle traces its lineage directly to the wet storage modifications developed for Sherman tanks in 1943 and 1944. The Sherman tank did not win World War II through superior firepower or armor protection compared to German heavy tanks. It won through industrial capacity expressed as availability, reliability, and continuous improvement based on combat feedback. Wet storage exemplified this improvement philosophy. American industry identified a lethal vulnerability, engineered a practical solution, implemented that solution across multiple production facilities, and saved thousands of crew lives without interrupting the delivery of tanks to combat units. German tank crews faced the same ammunition fire risks throughout the war, without systematic efforts to address the problem through design modification. Panther crews learned to fear penetrating hits not because their armor was inadequate, it was substantially thicker than Sherman armor, but because ammunition fires were nearly as probable as in American dry storage tanks. Tiger crews operated vehicles with fearsome reputations and impressive combat records, while knowing that any penetration-striking ammunition would likely result in catastrophic fire. German engineering excellence produced formidable weapons but did not extend to protecting crews from preventable deaths. The final production figures tell the story of American industrial capacity applied to crew protection. From January 1944 through the end of Sherman production in 1946, American factories produced approximately 21,000 wet storage Sherman tanks in various configurations. These vehicles equipped American, British, French, and Polish armored divisions during the final year of European combat and continued serving in Korea, with Israeli forces through the 1960s and with numerous other armies into the 1980s. Every one of those 21,000 tanks represented the accumulated knowledge gained from early Sherman losses in North Africa. Every one incorporated ammunition storage improvements developed through systematic ballistic testing and engineering analysis. Every one provided its crew with substantially better survival prospects when hit than the early M4A1 tanks that fought at El Alamein. The cost of learning these lessons was measured in lives rather than industrial capacity. Tank crews who burned in dry storage, Shermans during 1942 and 1943, died so that the Armored Board could document the problem, engineers could develop solutions, and factories could implement improvements. The crews who survived penetrating hits in wet storage Shermans during 1944 and 1945 benefited from knowledge purchased at terrible price by the men who came before them. This pattern repeated throughout the war, across all weapons systems and all combatant nations. Combat revealed flaws that peacetime testing never uncovered. Men died learning lessons about what worked and what failed under battlefield conditions. The survivors benefited from modifications and improvements developed in response to those deaths. The cycle was brutal, unforgiving, and ultimately decisive in determining which military forces adapted successfully and which failed to learn from experience. American military culture emphasized learning from mistakes and implementing improvements based on empirical evidence rather than theoretical assumptions. This culture enabled the wet storage development despite the modification's complexity and the challenge of changing established production systems. German military culture emphasized technical sophistication and theoretical superiority, but proved less capable of implementing practical modifications to address known vulnerabilities. Soviet military culture accepted higher casualty rates and relied on overwhelming numerical superiority rather than individual crew protection. The Sherman tank with wet storage embodied American advantages in industrial maturity, practical engineering philosophy, and willingness to modify designs based on field experience. It was not the best tank of World War II by most individual specifications. It was not the most heavily armored, or most powerfully gunned, or fastest. It was the tank that could be produced in overwhelming numbers, while incorporating continuous improvements that increased crew survival and combat effectiveness. Tank crews understood this reality better than historians or analysts examining the war decades later. They knew their Shermans were outgunned by Panthers and Tigers. They knew their armor was thinner than German heavy tanks. They also knew that wet storage meant they might survive a hit that would have killed them in an early production Sherman. They knew their tanks would start reliably every morning while German tanks sat broken and abandoned along roadsides. They knew American logistics would deliver ammunition, fuel, and spare parts while German supply systems collapsed. These practical considerations mattered more than technical specifications on paper. A wet storage Sherman that reached the battlefield with a trained crew, adequate ammunition, reliable mechanical function, and 12% fire probability when hit could execute its tactical mission. A Panther with superior specifications that broke down en route to the front or burned from ammunition fire when struck served no purpose, regardless of its theoretical advantages. The evolution of wet storage design continued beyond initial production implementation. Early wet storage tanks used a water and glycerin mixture that proved problematic in several respects. The glycerin component, while providing better thermal properties than pure water and preventing freezing in cold weather operations, exhibited corrosive characteristics that gradually damaged the steel containers holding the liquid. Maintenance crews reported discovering corroded ammunition bins during routine inspections, with the glycerin mixture eating through welds and compromising structural integrity. By mid-1944, American ordnance authorities replaced the glycerin mixture with a proprietary compound marketed as Amudamp. This new formulation provided equivalent thermal protection and freeze resistance while substantially reducing corrosion rates. The transition from glycerin to Amudamp occurred gradually, as tanks already in the field retained their original mixture, while new production incorporated the improved compound. Instructions for converting existing wet storage tanks from glycerin to Amudamp were distributed to field maintenance units, though many crews simply drained their ammunition bins entirely, rather than managing liquid maintenance in combat conditions. The draining of wet storage systems became increasingly common as the war progressed. Maintenance manuals from 1945 and subsequent years included detailed procedures for removing all liquid from ammunition bins, essentially converting wet storage tanks back to dry storage configuration. This practice emerged from multiple factors including maintenance, burden, liquid leakage, creating slippery conditions inside tanks, and crew preference for avoiding the complications of liquid-filled systems in field conditions. Statistical analysis conducted after the war examined whether drained wet storage tanks maintained any fire protection advantage. The data suggested that even empty, the relocated floor ammunition storage provided meaningful protection compared to the original sponson and turret basket placement. Ammunition positioned below the turret ring and beneath the track line remained less vulnerable to penetrating hits, regardless of whether water jackets contained liquid. The physical relocation of ammunition contributed as much to fire reduction as the liquid thermal protection. This finding validated the comprehensive nature of wet storage design rather than undermining its effectiveness. The engineers who developed the system understood that protection required multiple layers. The liquid jackets provided one barrier against ignition. The relocated floor position provided another by moving ammunition away from likely hit locations. The reinforced storage containers provided structural integrity that prevented ammunition scattering when struck. The combination of these factors produced the dramatic fire reduction documented in combat statistics. Field modifications and crew adaptations further refined wet storage effectiveness in combat operations. Some tank crews developed procedures for loading ammunition in specific sequences that maximized protection while maintaining rapid fire capability. They learned to keep high-explosive shells, which were less vulnerable to sympathetic detonation than armor-piercing rounds with explosive fillers, in the most exposed ready-rack positions while storing armor-piercing ammunition in the most protected floor bins. These crew-developed techniques represented the kind of practical knowledge that never appeared in technical manuals but significantly impacted combat survivability. The training of replacement crews evolved to incorporate lessons learned from wet storage operations. Tank schools in the United States modified their curricula to emphasize ammunition handling procedures specific to wet storage configurations. New loaders practiced reaching down to floor-mounted bins rather than pulling rounds from chest-height sponson racks, developing the muscle memory and spatial awareness required for efficient loading under combat stress. Drivers learned to avoid sudden maneuvers that might cause liquid to slosh violently in ammunition jackets, potentially damaging seals or creating leaks. Combat after-action reports from armored units consistently documented wet storage effectiveness through specific engagement descriptions. A typical report from the 3rd Armored Division in March 1945 described a Sherman platoon engaged by German anti-tank guns near the Rhine River. 5 tanks were hit, with German 75mm rounds penetrating armor on 4 vehicles. Of the 4 penetrated tanks, none caught fire. Crews evacuated 3 vehicles that suffered mechanical damage or crew casualties. The 4th vehicle remained operational and continued fighting after the wounded loader was replaced. The report specifically noted that all 5 tanks were M4A376W models with wet storage. Comparable engagements involving dry storage, Shermans earlier in the war typically resulted in substantially different outcomes. A 2nd Armored Division report from July 1944 in Normandy described 6 tanks hit during an engagement with concealed German anti-tank positions. 5 of the 6 hit tanks caught fire immediately, with total crew losses exceeding 20 men killed or severely burned. The surviving tank withdrew after its commander was wounded. All 6 tanks in this engagement were M4A1 models with dry ammunition storage, part of a unit that had not yet received wet storage variants. The statistical disparity between these outcomes was not coincidental or the result of different tactical situations. Wet storage fundamentally changed what happened when German anti-tank rounds penetrated Sherman armor. The modification did not prevent penetration. German guns remained capable of defeating Sherman armor at combat ranges throughout the war. Wet storage changed the consequences of penetration from near-certain catastrophic fire to manageable damage that often allowed crew survival and sometimes permitted continued vehicle operation. German tank crews facing Shermans in combat never developed comparable awareness of wet storage modifications. German intelligence services documented the appearance of new Sherman variants with revised ammunition storage. But the tactical significance of these changes remained unclear to frontline troops. Panzer commanders continued engaging Shermans using tactics developed against early dry storage models, aiming for side shots that would strike ammunition storage areas. These tactics remained effective against wet storage Shermans in terms of achieving penetration and vehicle disablement, but they no longer produced the reliable catastrophic fires that had characterized earlier engagements. The absence of visible external differences between dry storage and wet storage Shermans prevented German gunners from distinguishing protected tanks from vulnerable ones. A wet storage M4A3 looked identical to a dry storage M4A3 from the perspective of a Panther or Tiger gunner at combat range. Only the W designation in American nomenclature indicated wet storage presence, and this information was not apparent to enemy forces. The result was tactical confusion, as German crews observed that Sherman fire rates appeared to be declining without understanding the engineering modifications responsible for this change. This intelligence gap reflected broader German weaknesses in technical intelligence collection and analysis. The Wehrmacht excelled at tactical intelligence, gathering information about enemy unit locations, strength, and immediate intentions. German technical intelligence proved less capable at identifying and understanding enemy equipment modifications, particularly when those modifications involved internal changes not visible during external examination. A captured wet storage Sherman might be photographed and measured without revealing the water-jacketed ammunition storage, unless the examining team specifically disassembled the vehicle and understood the significance of what they discovered. American technical intelligence demonstrated superior capability in this regard throughout the war. When German tanks were captured, American ordnance teams systematically disassembled every component, documented construction techniques, analyzed metallurgy, and incorporated findings into detailed technical reports distributed to relevant development authorities. This methodical approach to understanding enemy equipment enabled American designers to identify both threats and potential improvements applicable to American vehicles. The contrast between American and German approaches to learning from combat experience extended beyond technical intelligence to encompass fundamental differences in military culture and industrial organization. American military forces operated within a culture that encouraged junior personnel to report problems, rewarded practical solutions over theoretical perfection, and maintained rapid communication between combat units and industrial producers. German military forces operated within a more rigid, hierarchical culture, where reporting problems might be interpreted as criticism of superior decisions, where theoretical technical superiority was valued over practical functionality, and where communication between frontline troops and industrial designers faced substantial bureaucratic obstacles. These cultural differences manifested in tangible ways throughout tank development programs. American tank crews wrote detailed reports about Sherman vulnerabilities, including ammunition fire problems. These reports reached ordnance authorities, who initiated testing programs that led directly to wet storage development. The entire process, from initial problem identification through combat implementation of the solution, required approximately 18 months from the El Alamein battles in October 1942 to wet storage production beginning in January 1944. German tank crews similarly reported problems with Panther and Tiger mechanical reliability, ammunition storage vulnerability, and various other deficiencies. These reports often failed to generate systematic improvement programs. Panthers continued suffering final drive failures throughout the war, despite field reports documenting the problem from the vehicle's initial deployment. Tigers maintained their complex overlapping road wheel suspension, despite maintenance crews reporting that this design made track changes extremely difficult under field conditions. The German military-industrial system proved capable of producing sophisticated advanced technology, but demonstrated limited ability to implement practical modifications addressing known problems. The ultimate measure of wet storage success appeared in crew survival statistics compiled during and after the war. Analysis of tank crew casualties across different Sherman variants showed that wet storage tanks had substantially lower crew fatality rates per vehicle lost compared to dry storage variants. This improvement resulted not just from reduced fire probability, but from the additional seconds of survival time wet storage provided, even when fires did occur. Those extra seconds allowed more crew members to evacuate before being overcome by flames or toxic smoke. The legacy of wet storage development influenced post-war American tank design across all subsequent generations. Every American main battle tank from the M46 Patton through the M1 Abrams incorporated lessons learned from Sherman ammunition storage problems and wet storage solutions. Modern tanks feature isolated ammunition compartments, blowout panels, automatic fire, suppression systems, and careful placement of ammunition away from crew positions. These design elements trace their conceptual origins directly to the engineering work conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1943. International tank design similarly adopted principles pioneered in Sherman wet storage development. British Centurion tanks, entering service shortly after World War II, featured protected ammunition storage below turret floors, with provisions for isolating crew compartments from ammunition fires. Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks incorporated separated ammunition storage, though Soviet designers continued accepting higher crew casualty rates in exchange for reduced vehicle height and simplified manufacturing. French AMX-13 and AMX-30 tanks featured oscillating turrets with isolated ammunition in the turret bustle, implementing fire protection through physical separation rather than liquid barriers. The specific technology of water-jacketed ammunition storage proved to be a transitional solution rather than a permanent design feature. By the 1950s, tank designers generally abandoned liquid-filled ammunition jackets in favor of other protection methods, including isolated compartments, blowout panels, and sophisticated automatic fire suppression systems using halon or other chemical agents. The principle of protecting ammunition from ignition and isolating crew spaces from fire consequences remained constant, even as specific implementation methods evolved with advancing technology. Sherman tanks with wet storage continued serving in combat roles for decades after World War II ended. Korean War operations from 1950 through 1953 extensively employed M4, a 3E8 Shermans, the Easy 8 variant with wet storage and horizontal volute spring suspension. Israeli Defense Forces operated Shermans, including wet storage variants through the 1960s and into the 1970s, with the tanks seeing combat in the 1956 Suez Crisis, 1967 Six-Day War, and 1973 Yom Kippur War. The longevity of Sherman service validated the durability and effectiveness of wartime modifications, including wet storage. The story of wet storage represents one chapter in the broader narrative of how industrial powers adapted military equipment based on combat experience. It demonstrates that victory in modern warfare depends not solely on initial equipment superiority, but on the ability to identify problems, develop solutions, implement improvements, and deliver modified equipment to combat units within timeframes that affect ongoing operations. American industrial and military systems excelled at this adaptive process. German systems, despite producing technically impressive equipment, proved less capable of systematic improvement based on field experience. This difference in adaptive capacity contributed as significantly to Allied victory as any single weapons system or tactical innovation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.